Good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of directors for the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And we welcome you to tonight's virtual outing. The Grand Canyon Historical Society, our mission is to celebrate and promote the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And just last year in 2024, we celebrated 40 years of existence when the society was started by some pioneer members of Grand Canyon Village. We encourage you to become a member. Our dues are only $35 a year. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we're hopeful that many of you can join us so that we can continue to expand all of our activities like these virtual outings and in-person outings and our tri-annual history symposiums. If you do become a member, you'll get 4 issues in the calendar year of the Old Pioneer magazine, which has a lot of history articles about the Grand Canyon and the Grand Canyon region. So we do these virtual outings. We conduct tours at the South and North Rim, and you can find it on our website. Our website is very easy, grandcanyonhistory.org.
So thanks everybody for joining us. As Tom mentioned, I have the honor of being in the Verkamp apartment as part of this astronomer in residency program. And it's really special for me because the program itself is outstanding, kind of a collaboration between Grand Canyon Conservancy, National Park Service, but also because I'm in the Verkamp residence. I had the honor of meeting Susie several times through the years. And I was telling some of you earlier, I was up here years ago when we got the meteorites that had been on display for years. It's now a little observatory. And so to be here in the aura of the Verkamp family and the Grand Canyon and the heritage here is really special. And then talking to other folks that are interested in Grand Canyon history, there's so many stories here. And there's not enough time in the day. Like I'm here a month and there's only less than 10 days left. And there's just so many more things I'm trying to do. My project here is giving a lot of public talks and doing star parties and stuff like that. And also something I started a few years ago is documenting the Apollo astronaut training that took place here. And there's a lot of things we're looking to do with that, from brochures and waysides to we're talking about possibly a book, and also even looking at some other things, getting maybe there's some current astronauts back here like the original ones did. So it's been real fun to be here. So there's so many stories about the canyon. How do you pick one? I haven't, I've picked many, but tonight I want to talk about Buckey O'Neill. He's one of my favorite characters, I think, in Arizona history, because he did so many different things. And he died at the young age of 38, but in that life he did so many things. And if you were to write, like a Wikipedia post about him, and you know how they write in there what this person did, they were an astronomer or a politician or something like that. For him, what do you pick? Because he did so many things. And so what I'd like to do tonight is talk about him a little bit. I know most or not all, or maybe everybody here is familiar, certainly with his name, if not some of his history, but I wanted to kind of fill you in a little bit because it's amazing wherever you go. At the South Rim, certainly there's the cabin named the Buckey O'Neill Cabin. If you, from certain viewpoints, you can see O'Neill Butte, or if you hike down the South Kaibab Trail, you can see it up close and personal. But beyond the Grand Canyon, he's well known. If you go to Prescott, a statue on the square that is officially called the Rough Rider statue, but if you're a Prescott person, they call it the Buckey O'Neill statue. Back in the 1940s, there was postage stamps made of the statue, but so many of the first day covers featured Buckey O'Neill in different ways. The casino down here is Bucky's, named after him, and Yavapai Community College their mascot is the Rough Riders because of Bucky. And even in the movie, if you saw the Rough Riders years ago, Sam Elliott plays the part of Buckey O'Neill, a nicely fictionalized account, but still, it just shows that, his name is so legendary, certainly in Arizona, northern Arizona, but he was one of the great characters of this territory turned state, territory in his lifetime. So who was he? Why do we have a cabin of him at the Grand Canyon? And why is there a butte named after him? And why a statue and all these other things? Well, that's what I want to talk about. And we could talk days about this because I think he's just such a fascinating character, but I won't talk for days. Historian William McLeod Rain, in analyzing Buckey O'Neill, said he's the most many-sided man Arizona has produced. And we're going to find that out. I'm going to just kind of run through his life and all the things he did. And you wonder, in 38 years, he did all this. And actually, it was most of what I'm going to talk about is just his time in Arizona. So it was only a couple decades that he did so many things. So let's go back his lineage a little bit. His father was named John O'Neill, and Bucky was born, or I should say, William Owen O'Neill, his full name, William Owen O'Neill. He was born in St. Louis, and John was his father, mother. There were several other siblings. They moved to Philadelphia, and then later on they moved back east, and they ended up in Washington, D.C. And in fact, John fought in the Civil War, got injured in what was called Meagher's Brigade. And so he spent the rest of his career in Washington, D.C. And this is where Bucky really grew up, or I should say, this is where William grew up. He wasn't called Bucky yet. And in fact, it's kind of interesting because he remembered later in life that where he grew up, he shot squirrels, went squirrel hunting a lot, and it was in Arlington, and it's on the site of where Arlington National Cemetery is today. And it's ironic because that's where both Bucky and his fathers are buried today. That's where they would both end up, because they would both serve in the military, as we'll see. So he's born in DC, he grows up in DC. There's records of him maybe getting a law degree, although historians have found no evidence of this. But he was a self-taught person, and he did a lot of different things, as we'll see. So in 1879, he was reading a Horace Greeley type newspaper, specifically about Arizona, saying, "Oh, if you're young and full of energy, come out to Arizona. It's a place where you can become a man and really find your worth. Not only for men, but women come out also. Come here, build a family, that sort of thing." And he was intrigued by this. And so he went out to Arizona in 1879. So he's not quite 20 years old, 19 years old. And so he gets a job right away at a newspaper, the Arizona Gazette. He's a typesetter. So he does that for money. And at nighttime, he helps out with the local sheriff, Henry Garfias. And mostly he does some of the dirty work.
Kevin, this is Tom. You've gone mute for some reason.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Wait, you've gone mute again.
Okay. I think in an effort to mute everybody, it looks like. So you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So anyways, at nighttime, William, still going by William, he helps round up drunks and throws them in jail. And so this is his life. He's young, he's energetic, he's getting involved in a lot of things. He's working during the day, helps round up drunks. And then he does something else that, so many young men did when they came out to Arizona. At nighttime, when he's not helping round up drunks, he's playing cards. And Faro was the common card game at the time. And in Faro, if you went for broke, if you put everything on the table, it was called bucking the tiger. And he did this a lot. And he would walk into a saloon and they'd say, oh, there's this guy bucking the tiger, and here he comes. And that got shortened to just Bucky. That's how he got his nickname. So now we have Buckey O'Neill, that's all the locals would know him as. It's unclear if he liked the name William. He despised the name Owen, and at one point said, if anybody calls me that, I'll shoot him. But there was an exception to that, as we'll find a little bit later on. So now we have Buckey O'Neill, off to a great start in Arizona, but he's a wanderlust. And so he decides to go down to Tombstone, and he works with John Clum at the Tombstone Epitaph. And he didn't stay there very long. It's unclear why, but he missed the gunfight by a matter of months. He left, he went to Albuquerque for a short time, and then he went to Prescott. Why he moved around like this the first couple of years is unclear. It's certainly possible that he was looking for a place with the most action, because he was a guy of action, as we'll see. So he arrives in Prescott in 1882, and it doesn't take him long to get involved in things. He's not only writing stories, but he buys into a newspaper called the Hoof and Horn, and he becomes the publisher. And the Hoof and Horn is a trade journal for cattlemen. One of the things they do is put in all the marks that different ranchers have to identify the cattle. So he runs this as his full-time job, but that's not all he does. So he's a publisher. He also becomes an investor, because one of the things, I think a common thread that you'll see going through his time in Arizona was he was a forward-thinking person, and he was one of those people that really saw the importance of building community, and with the goal of Arizona becoming a state. He was a real big proponent of Arizona becoming a state. And of course, that wouldn't happen until 1912, well after he died, but he did a lot to make it happen, laid the groundwork. One of these things was investing in an irrigation canal, because he realized that if Arizona is to develop and is to become a state, water is a major issue. And of course, that still is an issue today. But he invested in this irrigation canal because he put his money where his mouth was. If he thought we should become a state and we should deal with the water situation, that he should help solve that by investing in the canal system. So he invested in that, in other things. As was not unusual for young men at the time, he also volunteered for a group that later became known as the Prescott Greys, kind of the local militia. And they didn't do much. I mean, it wasn't like working for the sheriff's office officially. But what they would do is occasionally go to things like hangings and make sure that everybody stayed, in order. Nobody tried to bust the guy out, that sort of thing. And it's interesting because, he was well known as a pretty tough guy, what we would call today a chain smoker, one cigarette after another. It seemed that he was a man's man. He could talk with ranchers. He could talk with miners. As we'll see later, he could talk with university trained people. He was truly a man's man. Around women, he was more shy, it seems. But he was, somebody you expect to be at the bar, and when you walked in there, everybody's head would turn. He had that, that presence, that this was somebody. And so he was tough. He was known to get into some fights. He didn't seek fights, but he certainly stood up for himself. And so it was a little embarrassing when here's this guy that's, earning his keep, making his way in the world, showing how tough he is, that the Prescott Greys, they were at a hanging, and they were just there to make sure no trouble broke out. And when the hangman, sprang the door, Bucky fainted. And for the rest of his life, I think it was maybe kind of like a Theodore Roosevelt thing, where the rest of his life he wanted to prove how tough he was. And so he certainly did that. But the story, years later, Bucky wrote this newspaper story several years later, A Horse of the Hash Knife Brand. And it's a very thinly veiled account, fictionalized account of that hanging. And so he had the ability to make fun of himself, even though on the inside he felt embarrassed that he fainted in front of all his colleagues. So he's doing this. He's doing the newspaper. I told you he was shy. He wasn't afraid of females, but he was kind of a shy guy. But he met one that he started to hang out with a lot. Her name is Kevin Schindler, a good, solid last name, I'll have to say. Her father was in charge of the Whipple Barracks, the military installment in Prescott. They got married, and to Pauline, she always called him Owen. And she knew that she was the only one that could get away with this. And if anybody overheard this and they started snickering, they knew that they had a fight on their hands. She was the only one that could call him this, but to her, he was Owen. So 1886, he's doing all this other stuff. He gets married, he's investing. He also decides to become a probate judge. And he liked the idea of getting into politics. Again, I think one of the driving forces for him was to put himself in leadership positions that would help push Arizona to statehood. I think that was a central theme for him. But, he also, like I said, he was very serious, and yet he also had a good sense of humor and didn't take himself seriously. When running for probate judge, he said, well, in the way of special qualifications, I have no advantage over 75% of my fellow citizens in the county. Yet I believe I am fully competent to discharge all duties incident to the office in an efficient manner if elected. If you coincide in this opinion, support me if you see fit. If you do not, you will by no means jeopardize the safety of the universe by defeating me. So a good sense of humor. He wants to win, but if not, the world's going to keep spinning. He's going to find other things to do. And he ends up winning by 8 votes. And so he wins his first election. He becomes probate judge. Now, being a probate judge, back then, you also got all these extra duties, the so-called ex officio duties. So if you were probate judge, you were also the ex officio county school superintendent. And so he got into this position, and in the past, it was kind of a blow-off position. It wasn't, the education system wasn't very strong. At the time, something like only 1 in 3 Arizona youth attended school. There was no compulsory education where you were required to go to school. And County Superintendent O'Neill thought this was a sham. He thought they may need to make a big difference. So he made a statement. He said, after he got into this office a little bit, he declared from the outset, the office has been a barnacle, a parasite, a fungus, and will continue to be while it lasts. And that he said to his boss, who was, the man in charge of the whole county school. So this was an example where I think he spoke his mind. He got involved in a lot of things. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind. It got him in hot trouble sometimes. It would cost him votes in future elections, especially when he started speaking out against the railroads and how they should be taxed. We'll get to this a little bit later, but when he was running for higher offices, he just couldn't understand why the railroads were given a lot of land where they were developing the railroads, and they weren't taxed, whereas anybody else who owned such land was taxed. And he made a stink about this, and the railroads didn't like it, and this cost him a lot of votes. So he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Another thing typical of young men at the time, become a volunteer fireman. He's a firefighter O'Neill now, joins the Tufts Hose Company. This isn't a picture of him, but it's a contemporaneous picture taken from that time in Prescott. So, when does he sleep? he's a publisher. He's doing these volunteer activities like being a firefighter. I mean, he's just got married. He's taken on these ex officio duties, but that's not enough. So in his spare time, he wrote a book because, like I said, he's really a visionary, looking at the future of Arizona. And this is just straight out of the Chamber of Commerce. I just want to read the segment because it gives an example of his writing style. And just what brought him out to Arizona, that newspaper story, he's kind of upping that a little bit in this entire book. In one section, he says, "If pure air there be, it is here. The step grows elastic, and one feels as though he had drunk of the fabulous fountain of eternal youth." And so it is throughout the years. The feeling of listless lassitude, which elsewhere makes life a burden, is never felt here. So I'm assuming that none of you listening has ever felt listless lassitude since you live in Arizona, and as he called it. So he could lay it on pretty thick in promoting the area. So, so he's done everything so far. So why not run for sheriff? At the time, the sheriff's office, this was the county was Yavapai County, and we're talking about Yavapai County at a time when the area was the same size as New York City or New York State. That's how big Yavapai County was at the time. It included present-day Coconino County, Yavapai, and some others. It was a huge area, and you think, wouldn't being sheriff be a full-time job plus? But no, he's still doing all these other things. So he becomes the sheriff, and again, with that office comes some of these other duties: adjutant general, the tax assessor, and this is when he started really irritating the railroads because he wanted to tax them for the railroads that came through town. So he's doing all this other stuff, and he also becomes a prospector. Part of his idea of developing Arizona was there's got to be some sort of economy, some way of driving an income for people to be able to come here. And prospecting was one of those things. As we'll see in a little bit, this brought him to the Grand Canyon, and he did a lot of prospecting here. But some of his early prospecting he did down in an area called Mayer. If you drive down I-17 from Flagstaff down south, get past, before you take the turns to Prescott, there's a turnoff there that says to Mayer. Well, there was a mine there that wasn't very well developed, and it was Mexican onyx, which was used for building tabletops and counters and that sort of thing. And so he went in with two friends. So they bought a share. They put in $150 a piece on this mine, and they spent a little time developing it. And they found a really thick layer that nobody had seen before. And they essentially had struck a rich. They sold without doing much else except for prospecting, buying it, developing it some, finding it, and then finding the rich vein and then selling it. They sold it for $200,000. So their total investment was $450. They sold it for $200,000. So they each made $67,000. So he was, typical of his other endeavors. It seemed like he had the golden touch. When he put his mind to things, it just worked out well. So this is while he's doing the sheriff duty, doing all these other duties. In fact, today you can go to the mine. There's still Mexican onyx being mined there. This is a picture from last year that I took. So he's developing these interests, but he also starts prospecting in the Grand Canyon. For years, early on, it didn't seem like he was interested in this, but when he was sheriff, especially, he really got to know the area very well. Coconino County or Yavapai County is huge. He got to know the Grand Canyon very well. He liked to come up here, start surveying for gold and other minerals. He also started thinking, boy, this is a pretty place. There was a stagecoach that ran from from Flagstaff but he started thinking maybe this is a place where tourism could be a big thing. But for the time being, he started really developing an interest in looking for minerals here. He developed a claim beneath what we know today, or near what we know today as O'Neill Butte, and that's why it's named in his honor. More copper than anything else. He also developed an interest in Anita, which is a mining area just south of the Grand Canyon. And all this interest in mining led him to get interested in something else that we'll talk about, and that's the railroad. Now, I have to take a slight diversion here because I'm here at the Verkamp Apartments as the astronomer in residence, but I'm talking about Grand Canyon history. That's not really too much astronomy, but I'm going to tell you a little bit here because there's something really kind of cool, I think. O'Neill Butte, let me see right here. O'Neill Butte, it was named after him because of the mining he did. Well, in the 1960s, the NASA astronauts came here to train because they were preparing to go to the moon. And scientists said, if you're going to go to the moon, we should do science, like picking up rocks, which will help us learn about not only the moon, but the solar system and how we were formed and how we got here. So we should do geology. But if we're going to do geology, we have to train the astronauts because they're test pilots. What do they know about picking up rocks? And so they decided the first place we're going to take them to train geology is the Grand Canyon, because that will inspire them to want to learn geology. And even though the rocks aren't the same as what they'd expect to find there, they'll still learn geologic principles, how to read the rocks and unveil the stories that those rocks tell. And so all the astronauts except for one came here to train. And that's why I'm here. I'm retracing what they did. It's been a years-long project, working part-time on it. But one thing that I found that was really interesting that has nothing to do with Buckey O'Neill except for the butte, which is named after him. But here's a picture from 1964, and these are some of the astronauts hiking down. And for those of you who've seen my Apollo program, you'll have heard this. There's this tree right there. You can see with the cursor, and it's still there, like 50 plus years later. This is what it looks like close up, and this is what it looks like close up, the modern picture. So that butte where Buckey O'Neill that developed his claims has this tree stump that's been there for years. And that sort of thing isn't necessarily unusual in the Southwest. You go to archaeological remains and you get wood a lot older, but it makes me wonder how long that stump has been there. It might have been there when Buckey O'Neill was in the area. I don't know, but I think it's kind of a fun thing to think about. So that's my astronomy astronaut tie-in, which is very loose, but I wanted to put it in there. So Bucky, who's developing these claims, he builds a cabin here on the rim. And this cabin would later be used partly as a hotel, partly as his office. Today we know it as part of the Bright Angel Lodge. But he built this cabin as a place to work out of. And he realized, all these mining claims, there's two things that's kind of coming together in his mind. One, if there is good mining claims here, how do we get it out? A stagecoach going to Flagstaff, that's not an efficient way to haul a lot of ore. So he starts coming up with an idea of a railway. And a railway originally that would come from Flagstaff, come up to the South Rim, and of course pass by the Anita mining area on the way to where that would be how they would get the ore out by this railway. So he started working on this. He wrote letters to congressmen. He worked with local politicians. He tried to raise money. It's hard to say if you can pinpoint one person as the quote unquote, father or mother of the Grand Canyon Railway, but he was certainly one of the key people. He didn't live to see it come about, but he really pushed for it. And as he was pushing for it, an idea that started with a way to transport ore turned into something else, because he realized that, some people that he got to know, like the Ralph Camerons and the Berries and other names, they were developing a tourism trade. And he really saw value in this and thought, this could be such a destination. And again, I think in the back of his mind, thinking about Arizona becoming a state, holy cow, if we could really develop these mining interests where there's income coming from that, and then if we can bring tourists here, more income, more occupations for people, this all goes towards Arizona statehood. So he started getting interested in tourism also, and really started pushing it. We already know he was promoting Arizona, where you can have avoid listless lassitude and so on. But he's really doing more than just writing a promotion. He's actively contacting Congress people to try to make something happen. Build a railway. There's got to be major funding for this, and that's got to have political backing to happen. And so he's working on these two things, trying to make them happen. What better way to make some of this stuff happen than to run for office? I would say much as Ralph Cameron did when he was trying to hold on to his ownership, his rights to Bright Angel, the trail and the hotel there. He ran for Congress, and by being a congressperson, he had a lot of power. I don't know if Buckey O'Neill was wired quite the same as Ralph Cameron, but he certainly saw the value of running for a higher office, again, to help drive this statehood idea. He would have a lot more success if he had power. So he ran twice as a congressional candidate for the territory, for the Arizona Territory. He lost both times, and they weren't really close elections because he was running as a third-person candidate, as a populist made popular by I forgot his name. He ran for president several times, but because the two parties weren't good enough, there had to be something in between. So the Populist Party was formed, and so O'Neill wasn't successful, but he still continued to make a name for himself around the territory. I put this slide in because he, in a way, helped with the founding of Low Observatory in Flagstaff in 1894. When a scout came out here named Andrew Douglas to find potential places to set up a telescope and an observatory, they contacted Buckey O'Neill, who gave some suggestions of where to set up. He also led archaeological parties. He met with archaeologist Fuchs, who did a lot of work in this area, took him to Montezuma's castle. And so, him losing office, twice didn't really slow him down. He just kept plowing forward. He still did a lot of political things. He was still prospecting. In the middle of this, became a father. And let me go back here. He also ran for mayor because, let's see, he's done publishing, prospecting, judge. He's been sheriff. Okay, there's mayor. He hasn't done that. He's run for Congress. That hasn't worked out yet. But my guess is if he had lived long enough, he would have ran again. But why not run for mayor? And by this point, he's so well known in Prescott. He has his enemies on a larger scale across the territory because of, largely because of his stance on the silver issue, and also wanting to tax the railroads and so on. But he runs for office. He knows so many of the miners and the camp people. He does pretty well. At one point, one of his detractors tried to catch him on something. trying to nail him on something, asked him about alcohol because it was known that he frequented bars and played cards. That was his nickname based on that. And they were trying to make it look out like he didn't have the values that it took to be a mayor. So they asked him, what's your stance on alcohol? What's your stance on liquor as the mayor of Prescott? And he said, if you're referring to that evil brew that softens the brains, ruins the kidneys, distorts the judgment, wrecks marriages, obliterates moral values, and turns man into an animal, then I'm against it. But if, on the other hand, you're referring to that magic potion that puts spring in an old man's step, stimulates conversation, enhances social contact, promotes the appetites, and gives surcease of sorrow, then I'm all for it. What a politician he is. He wins, becomes mayor. And one of the things he does as mayor is to try to, let me go back so I don't get ahead of myself. One of the things he does as mayor is to try to reinvigorate community pride, because Prescott twice had been the capital of Arizona, and it had just been, the capital had moved again to Phoenix, the final move. And so there's a certain amount of pride that got dinged in Prescott, because this was the capital, this was the center of the territory. And for Buckey O'Neill, I suspect it was a little bit extra painful because he wanted statehood, and the center of it, should be in his hometown. And so he did a lot to reinstill community pride, from planting flowers around the courthouse to other community activity. So he spent a good amount of time doing that. But then it all changed very rapidly in 1898, when the USS Maine was sunk down in the harbor in Cuba. And this war was, in hindsight, was almost farcical, because it was a creation of yellow journalism. The Hearsts and the Pulitzers with yellow journalism, making headlines, trying to sell newspapers. And they made this event into a war, like we are being attacked. We have to stand up for ourselves and our fellows who live down there. In hindsight, it's unclear if that explosion was even caused by Spanish or Cubans or anybody else, or if it was just an explosion in the engine room that wasn't uncommon in that kind of vessel. But the newspapers made it out to be a big deal. And of course, they're going to send their correspondents down there to give you a detailed account of our boys fighting for freedom and this sort of thing. Well, people like Theodore Roosevelt, who was building a name for himself, he was assistant secretary of the Navy at the time. He saw this as a great opportunity to not only put himself in a higher position of leadership, but to establish the United States as a world power. He saw this as a perfect opportunity. So he helps put together a group of volunteers, the first US volunteer cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders. So Theodore Roosevelt has this, I think, this master idea of building America into a superpower, as we would call it today. Meanwhile, on a smaller scale, we have Buckey O'Neill, who's now Captain O'Neill, because he realizes, there's this volunteer cavalry being put together, and there are going to be troops. Initially, there are about 1,000 troops that came from Arizona Territory, New Mexico Territory, Oklahoma. And he saw it as a golden opportunity. If we Arizonans volunteer, go down there, really represent ourselves well, it's going to really look good for Arizona. That, we're not even a member, we're not a state in the union, and we believe in the cause. So we're going to go down and fight for the country. So to him, this was a perfect opportunity, another drive towards statehood. So he was mustered in he was officially the first one mustered in. He wanted to be first, again, to show that Arizonans were serious about this. So he went the day before the official mustering ceremony and convinced the powers that be to let him sign up. So he was the first one. And it's a fascinating story. You think about this guy who did so much for the development of Prescott, of the Grand Canyon, of Arizona, and now he's going to go off to war. And it's always interesting to go back in time and play the what if game. What if this happened or what if that happened? But the fact is, he went down there in horrible conditions. He famously said, "Who would not gamble for a new star in the flag?" Again, we could show how important Arizona is to the country by going down there. They do training in San Antonio. He's elected one of the captains. So down in front is the mascot of the group, a wildcat, a cougar. Here's Theodore Roosevelt. And then it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but number 25 is Bucky O'Neill. And Theodore Roosevelt was really impressed with this guy. One thing he noticed was he just had a way about him that impressed people. And Henley, can you give me a piece of paper in there? Blank piece of paper, yeah. He was really impressed by him because the Rough Riders were a combination. There were some miners and cowboys from the West, like from Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, but there were also a lot of what we would call Eastern dandies. There were several of Roosevelt's friends from the university. Roosevelt got along well with all of them. But when he was working with these men, he soon found that this guy, Bucky O'Neill, really stood out because he didn't just talk, gutter talk, playing poker when they were hanging out at night. He was thoughtful, forward-thinking. He would quote poets, and it really struck Roosevelt. Another thing that struck him was when the ships that were so overstuffed they couldn't take horses, and a cavalry without horses isn't a cavalry. So they didn't have their horses. There were just a few. But when they were landing in Cuba off the ships, the conditions were so bad that in some cases, the horses they did have, they just had to push them into the water and hope they could swim to shore. Other times, getting on shore for the men, a couple of them sank. They couldn't get to shore. They started sinking. In one case, Bucky O'Neill saw a buffalo soldier, a black soldier, sinking because he had all his gear on, and Bucky O'Neill jumped in to try to save him, and he wasn't able to. But Theodore Roosevelt noticed this and was just impressed by this guy who obviously would go to the ends of the earth to anybody on his team. And in fact, I want to read something to you that Roosevelt wrote about Bucky O'Neill in the book that Roosevelt wrote after the war ended. Just to encapsulate his idea about Bucky O'Neill. Most of the men had simple souls. They could relate facts, but they said very little about what they dimly felt. Bucky O'Neill, however, the iron-willed, iron-nerved fighter from Arizona, the sheriff whose name was a byword of terror to every wrongdoer, white or red, the gambler who with unmoved face would stake and lose every dollar he had in the world. He alone among his comrades was a visionary, an articulate emotionalist, who was very quiet about it, never talking unless he was sure of his listener. But at night, when he leaned on the railing to look at the Southern Star, another good astronomy type, he was less apt to tell tales of his hard and stormy past than he was to speak of the mysteries which lie behind courage and fear and love, behind animal hatred and animal lust, for the pleasures that have a tangible shape. He had keenly enjoyed life, and he could breast its turbulent torrent as few men could. And he goes on. So Bucky O'Neill really stood out to the likes of Theodore Roosevelt as a real leader, a real thoughtful person. And it's sad, the ending. They got down there. The quote of the officers made the officers get killed, wounded, or promoted. And many of them did, all of those practically. But they got down there, the conditions were horrible. And in July 1898, there were, or the following year, they were fighting the day before Roosevelt led the charge up San Juan Hill. They were on an adjacent hill in Kettleman Hill. And, Bucky O'Neill was always, he had that it factor, the leader factor, brazen, maybe to a fault, because there's a legend that whether this is true, this part was true, we don't know, but there was a lot of shooting back and forth, and the Spanish were shooting back at the American forces, and Bucky O'Neill's men were saying, get down, they're shooting at us. And he supposedly said, the Spanish bullet is not molded that will kill me, showing how tough he was. Who knows if he actually said that? It's debatable by historians, but the fact is that supposedly within moments of saying this, whether he said it or not, he got shot right through the mouth and died on the spot. And he was buried right there, 38 years old. And it's just tragic. I was saying, what if we played the what if game? What if he hadn't been shot? Because he was a leader that was getting the attention of the likes of Theodore Roosevelt, who would become one of the strongest leaders the country has had. Whether you agree or not with Roosevelt's politics, he changed the course of the United States in a lot of ways. He was one of the strongest leaders, again, in United States history. And he recognized Bucky O'Neill. And we see all the things that Bucky O'Neill did. It's a shame that he didn't live to see his dream of the Grand Canyon Railway happen. He missed it by a couple of years. But again, he did so much to make that railway happen. It's hard to say if it would have happened if it hadn't been for him. You don't know. But he did so many things to build this territory. I should say, after he died, he was buried on spot. Several years later, his brother went back with a chaplain that had been down at the fighting. They found where he had been buried, exhumed his body, and brought it back to Arlington Cemetery. And Bucky O'Neill is buried there, not far down from where his father is buried, kind of in the vicinity of Lee's Mansion, if you're familiar with that area. So we remember Bucky O'Neill today. They built a statue called the Rough Rider statue in Prescott. And a trivia question: who sculpted this? Or who? It was Solon Borglum, Gutzon Borglum's brother. Gutzon was the one who led doing Mount Everest or Mount Rushmore, and so his brother is the one that did the Rough Rider monument. And as a postmark, because it's so fun to me to talk about legends of Grand Canyon, of Arizona, but of course there's the other side. There so often their spouses and the women who were involved that we were just recently getting more stories about. Bucky's wife, or I should say Owen's wife, as she would call him, was a remarkable woman. She was Bucky's spouse, but also she was a remarkable woman on her own. She was a suffragist, two-time Arizona legislator. She ended up marrying Bucky's brother after Bucky died. They got married a few years later. But she was one of the early leaders in Arizona politics, and one of the first female leaders of the country, of the territory. And I think we should remember her also, because she lived such an important life. But years later, in hindsight, when people look back at Bucky O'Neill, this is one quote: had he returned from Cuba, he could have had any political office that Arizona could offer. It's hard to imagine, based on what he had done, if he had survived. That's a big if, but he would have come back, a hero, would have run for office again. I mean, that was his career path. Likely would have won, you would think. It's just interesting if you could replay it, how it would play out. But be that as it may, you could also argue that he became a martyr because he died. He was a hero, and then he died. So that really helped things along the way also. Just like John F. Kennedy declaring we're going to go to the moon, he got assassinated. The rallying cry, we have to finish what Kennedy started. If Kennedy had lived, would that have happened? I don't know. Maybe that project would have died, but our martyred leader, we're going to carry out his wishes. So, maybe that was part of what pushed through the railway. I don't know. But in any event, I think this gives a little idea of who Bucky O'Neill was. Such an important part of Arizona, certainly of the Grand Canyon, and what the Grand Canyon looks like today in terms of visitation, in terms of the development. Again, whether there, you look back and say, should we have brought the railroad here or not? Should we have preserved it as it was, pristine, without that? That's something you can debate, but however we see that, the way the Grand Canyon is today, with tourism, with mining that took place through the years, and with the railway, he certainly played a huge role in that. I think it's fun to be able to talk about that. So that's the end of my program about Bucky O'Neill. I'll end with this slide. This is him and what we know today is the O'Neill Cabin. And several years ago, my wife and I stayed there. So I couldn't find a wine bottle and put a candle in it, but otherwise it's kind of the living room where he was. So that's Bucky O'Neill. I think one of the most interesting characters and somebody who's really played a big role in Grand Canyon history. So with that, I'll stop sharing and stop blabbing, and then open up if anybody has any questions or comments or corrections to what I've said.
Well done,
Now's a
Kevin.
good time.
Well done. Thank you so very much for this presentation. I've got a couple quick questions for you, and then we're going to open questions up to everyone.
Okay.
Looking at the headstone there, it looks like Bucky was born in Ireland. Is that correct?
It's great because depending on which official record you look at, there's Ireland, there's St. Louis, there's Philadelphia. There's several different places where he was born. But that gravestone was made not long after he was relocated. But it seems like the historic record seems to show that it seems likely he was born in St. Louis.
Okay.
And
All right.
and it's interesting also because in his the card for him mustering into the Rough Riders, it asked occupation, and he wrote down lawyer. And there's two historians that did a lot of work on him. Dale Walker was one who wrote a book about him, and it came out in a couple versions. Nobody found any evidence that he went to law school, and he was involved in the courts, but as a probate judge, he helped out in other capacities. But there doesn't seem to be any records of him being a lawyer, and yet that's what he wrote down. He could have written a dozen other things that there are clear records of that he did, but the lawyer is, so it's one of the issues of looking back in history, 120 years, whatever, record keeping was so poor. And, birth certificates, birth records, census was one of the better records of the time, but it's a good example of just how unusual so much of, retracing some of this, how many different statements there are.
Yeah. Okay. And then, you share an interesting last name with Pauline. Have you tracked that down?
I've tracked down my family side, but not hers too much. I mean, mine goes back to the Saxon area in Germany, and it's a fairly common name there through the years. And so, yeah, Pauline, Oscar, you know, there's a couple good people with a Schindler name, certainly.
Okay, and then
I don't connection. I used to call Oscar Uncle Oscar, but there's really, you know, I don't have any evidence that there's any direct connection.
last question I've got for you. They had a child or children?
Right. They had one child who died.
Okay.
And it's really sad because in his hoof and horn paper, he put on the front page, very proud father, but he died from illness at a very young age. And that just, because he was junior, and that really hurt. But then they adopted a boy named Maurice,
Okay.
a little bit later on. And so they had one child together, but the child didn't last. And, you know, we go back to those days and it just, you know, as a parent, to me, it's gut wrenching to even think about, or when you go to an old cemetery, like, you know, a place like Jerome, where you see these really small areas, fenced areas, that was clearly a child. And you don't even want to think about it. You know, a parent losing your child that should never happen.
Okay. Well, with that, anybody who has any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and bring your questions on in. Someone in the chat had a really good post here that said, yeah, the mustering in paperwork showed Ireland as his birthplace. Right. Got it.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, Ireland is his birthplace, and he's a lawyer.
right.
So, but yeah, it's, you know, I really think, you know, Dale Walker, there are two different biographies about, the kind of full biographies about Buckey O'Neill. A guy named Keith Lee in the 1950s, and then Dale Walker in the 70s, I think. I have a copy of that book here. I don't remember the exact date, but it feels like, you know, we could go back in time, and with modern ability to do genealogy and look at records, maybe we can narrow down and correct some of the misinformation that's out there.
Yeah.
I think it's a great project in so many, not just for Buckey O'Neill, but so many other things that, my gosh, it's amazing what you can find on the internet, or you can find, if you don't find the information, you find the right contacts that, you know, not too long ago was really difficult to do.
Right. Anybody have any questions for Kevin? You need to.
Kevin, this is Mark Braden. Can you hear me?
Hi, Mark. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding Bucky. He was kind of a self-educated man, and but at the same time, as I understand, he's denigrated the position of educator. Why was that?
It was that ex officio position that came with the position he was elected to. That just came along with it. You know, it's like, be careful what you volunteer for, because you'll, you know, do all these other things. It's kind of interesting, but on the other hand, you know, for especially Arizonans at the time, you know, there wasn't a high proportion of educated people anyways. But it's interesting. There, another debate with him is, did he go to college? What did he study? And that was one of the questions. Did he go to law school? But maybe he did, but there's just no evidence. And he wouldn't have gone very long, because he came out here when he was, whatever, 19 years old.
And he didn't see the path to education as a path for statehood as well?
You know, that's a good question. He never commented on it that I've seen anything, or that any of the historians have commented on. Now he, you know, he did push. I mean, he's given credit with pushing for the compulsory education, you know, law, I guess you would call it, because at the time, you know, like 1 in 3 kids went to school, and but he didn't hold that position for very long, but he did think there should be some sort of law. It came after his time, but he has been given some credit for, bringing attention to that.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, somebody, Kern mentioned the Canyon Diablo robbery. It's such a great Arizona story where the Canyon Diablo, where the big bridge was east of Flagstaff, between Flagstaff and Winslow. And there's a robbery. Buckey O'Neill got 3 deputies and they chased them for weeks across Arizona into Utah, finally caught them. There's so many great parts of that story, like the one, supposedly, this is one of the stories that may or may not be true, but supposedly the one robber, they had not only gotten some money, but also some jewelry. And this guy, when they stopped to kind of regroup, repack their stuff, and then take off again, escaping from the law, he had some like diamond rings, and he broke the diamonds out just so he would have those, and he stuck them in his pocket where he kept the makings for his pipe. And supposedly somewhere along the way, they're running from the law, going, hundreds of miles. At some point, he, fills up his pipe and then smokes it, and then taps it out on the shoe when he's done. Forgot all about the diamonds, and realized later that he dumped them all. So they're lying around somewhere in Arizona. But there's so many. It's such a great story. That's really a program in itself. That's pretty fascinating. Somebody asked about booking the cabin. Oh, I see Kaylee put this in there. I do know that that it's on the high side as hotels go. When I stayed there 15, 20 years ago, it was something like $250, and we only stayed there because it was like a special celebration. But on the other hand, when we stayed there, we thought, we could have paid for it by just, there's the door is one of those that half of it opens, and so we opened that, and visitors kept coming up and taking a peek, and so we thought, all we have to do is that, for $1, you can come in and take a look at the place. We probably could have paid for the room in no time. But it really is neat to see it, and it's a huge place to stay. And I see Karen is putting some information about booking it, and Haley's put some more about you can't book it online. And yeah, the talk tonight, I'm up here as astronomer in residence, and I'm doing a bunch of astronomy talks up here. And I've done some down at Phantom Ranch and at Havasupai Gardens, and then at the Grand Canyon School here also. But tonight, we thought it'd be fun to do this about Buckey O'Neill, just because I'm not sure that the Historical Society, if we've had a program about Buckey O'Neill, at least in recent years. But yeah, I agree. He's really a mythical character that is just, I think it's a neat story.
Kevin, can you hear me?
Yes. Yep. Oh, hi, Dick.
Yes. Buckey O'Neill was very much involved in copper mining below the rim, not just on the rim. And
Right,
in
yeah.
fact, we keep talking about things named after Buckey O'Neill. Another one is the O'Neill Shaft on Horseshoe Mesa, which was part of the Last Chance Mine. He actually supervised mining operations there for a period of time. Our last talk that we had, I think earlier this month, we talked about O'Neill Spring on the west side of Horseshoe Mesa. It's a rather pitiful spring, but
Yeah.
it probably was named by Bucky when he took over the Last Chance Mine.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah,
thanks.
That's great. I'm glad you mentioned that because, it's funny in talking about Buckey O'Neill, there's so many different things he did. And just like when he was sheriff in the Diablo Canyon heist, his mining, there's a story within the story. Everything he did it's just like he was a magnet for action. Like when he was at one time he was in his early years in Prescott, whatever the title is, he was at the courthouse just to ensure that nobody got in trouble. It was like a court, whatever he's called, like he's the policeman on charge. And a fight broke out. Somebody pulled a pistol. He got in the middle of it to try to stop it, and he got knifed right in the webbing of one of his between his fingers. And it seemed like whatever he did, there was always something, there was some sort of action. So I'm glad you all brought up some of these other things, because there's so many stories about him that are really fabulous.
I want to thank you, Kevin. This was a great presentation. I think we all know Bucky O'Neill a little bit better tonight. Thank you.
And thank you. And I see this mention about Joanna. I haven't heard this one about the pistol in the well, but the Waffle Iron restaurant, that's where their house was, where Bucky and Pauline lived, where Owen and Pauline lived. And there used to be a plaque there because it was also the home right there of the Munns, like the namesake of Munns Park, who again, both male and female, both husband and wife, played an important role in the development of Arizona. So lots of great history down there. Oh, I agree, Bill. Like a program on the Kolbs. I don't know, maybe Dick and some of the other senior members of the society know when some programs have been done about the Kolbs, but I know, there have been a couple of books written about them, and I suspect we did some programs and those came out, but I'm not really sure about that. But that's a great idea.
Well, with that,
Joanna pointed out that Pauline sold the house to the Munns. I'm not sure, Joanna, do you know if that plaque is still there? There used to be one there talking about them living there. Okay. That was the only time I've eaten at that restaurant, was just because I wanted to be on site where Bucky and Pauline had lived.
very cool. Well, I'm wondering if it's time to wrap it up. Any more questions for Kevin? Well, with that, I'd like to invite you all to come back, same time, same place, 2 weeks from now, when Melissa Sivney is going to give a presentation on Braving the Wild River, her new book about Elzada Clover and Lois Jotter and the first botanical survey of the Grand Canyon. Kevin, thank you so very, very much for your presentation tonight. This presentation is recorded and will be online. You can tell your friends they can come see it again. You can come see it again. And hope you all have a good night. And we'll see you again in a couple weeks. Y'all take care. Good night.